Test, test, test. Hey, folks. Welcome to Neurofeedback and Chill. Tonight we're talking about sports performance and a new metadata study that came out about sports. So let me know if you can hear me. I seem to have constant audio and visual difficulty, but I think I can hear myself, so at least that's something. Good start. So I see we have a few folks already joining us. Hello, Radar Ashwood. Hello, Ryan. Some good questions. Ryan's asking what's a minimum time for a session of neurofeedback. If I had to choose what's more effective, once a week or 30-minute sessions spread throughout the week. The latter, but I want to get into that a little bit both in the sport context for you, Ryan, as well as show you a few things, I think, into the mechanism of neurofeedback that'll give you some perspective on how things can evolve. At least a little bit of hint into that, a little deeper look. So I also see Radar Ashwood. Hey, Radar. Hope you guys are well tonight. And let me see. Video capture, show title. Yeah. Turn that off. Okay, so welcome to Neurofeedback and Chill. If we haven't met, I am Andrew Hill. I'll be your neuroscientist tonight, or this morning if you're watching this tomorrow, or some other time. I helped found a couple of biohacking and brain-focused wellness companies. One is Peak Brain Institute that does brain mapping or quantitative EEG, as well as neurofeedback, and also True Brain, which builds nootropic products and ketone products these days. Someone just asked a question about ketones. Radar is asking, how does being in ketosis affect the EEG? Oh, it's a great question. It depends a little bit on the individual. If you're not used to, if you're truly in ketosis, you'll see not a huge impact, I don't think. You might see some wakefulness, basically, but if you're not used to being in a ketosis state, you'll also see a cortisol effect. You'll see a lower blood sugar effect, which will be a slowed EEG slightly, and a lower power EEG. But if you're well adjusted, you might be able to. Yeah. Hey, Jehan, how are you tonight? Could you talk a bit about how you use nootropics or which you might recommend? Yeah, maybe a little bit. That might be its own live stream or discussion. The short answer is I like to hit big resources with other more impactful things first, and then use nootropics either as needed for gap filling or to optimize features of aging, or instead of pharmacological solutions, perhaps. But that's a vague answer because nootropics are a pretty specific topic. So I'm going to keep that one vague for you, Jehan. Sorry. If you ask me specific questions, I'll get into it more deeply. But it's very individualized, also a real part of the answer. So I wanted to talk tonight about sports. You know, we always talk about efficacy and impacts, and there was a new metadata study just published, and it's probably the most rigorous look we've had yet at whether neurofeedback works, especially for athletes. So the shape of this metadata study, looking across several studies, It was a total of 21 studies with 271 participants. 271, pretty big overall N. And here's the headline: EEG neurofeedback shows a moderate boost to sport motor performance, physical performance, with a Hedges G correlation of 0.78, which is a Cohen, I think, equivalent of 0.8, which moves into strong effect, basically. And in sports, where a few percentage points make a difference, that could really be interesting. So here's what is really interesting in this metadata study, though. If you rank the quality of the studies, you can do like a split half where high quality studies show a large effect size of over 1.07, more than double the effect of 0.49 found in the other half of the studies. So let me break down what this might mean if you're a golfer, an archer, shooter, basketball player, anyone doing sort of precision motor sports, physical sports. This will matter too for things like esports. I work with a lot of athletes across different ranges, and esports is one of the ones that I see neurofeedback having a very large impact on. I mean, think about it: impulsivity, sustained focus, that kind of stuff. So, a couple questions. Radar's asking: train up lower alpha 7 and 10 at PZ? Sure. Then followed up with training up peak alpha during the same session. Not at PZ. Yeah, you shouldn't do two different frequencies at PZ. I wouldn't say it's a good idea. In the same session. Hey Ilya, howdy. If possible, to comment on best dietary support when undergoing a neurofeedback course, or if it's no different than the good dietary support in general. It's mostly the latter, but if you have seizures, you may want to consider a ketosis level that's more supporting of suppressing seizures. If you're trying to recomp or work on aging, there may be reasons to affect diet that aren't just optimizing the neurofeedback that could play into your goals. But no, you can train straight through. Generally, unlike your body, where you can't outrun a bad diet, when it comes to neurofeedback, you can train the brain straight through a lot of stuff. Although a lot of providers will ask you to do things like drop drugs and alcohol, drop wheat, etc. And, it doesn't matter as much as I think most people think it does. The brain is pretty powerful top down. So, all right, so let me talk about these studies. So what makes this meta-analysis different than previous reviews? Because, we've seen neurofeedback research before. There's 1,000+ studies with weekly positive results. There's a few metadata studies that things kind of average out and wash out. This study had three critical differences. First, it focused on motor performance outcomes, actual sports skills like putting, shooting, that kind of stuff, archery, darts, that kind of thing. The sort of real world nature of that makes a huge difference in maybe tracking this into an actual sport performance context, not just measuring something more in isolation. Previous meta-analysis mixed in cognitive testing, for instance, with the behavioral performance and questionnaires, but this one only real world motor performance, physical performance. Second, there was a criteria list by Thomas Ross that was developed called the CRED-NF, which evaluates study quality, sort of looks at how we can rate studies. And this is a scientific consensus-based standardization developed for neurofeedback research by leaders like Thomas Ross and others. So think of it like quality control for neurofeedback, whether studies do a few things. One, properly report participant strategies. Two, document data methods. Three, justify their reinforcement schedules, how often they provide rewards. Four, show regulation success based on the feedback signal, i.e. changes in the right direction of the training. So, and then correlate brain changes with behavior outcomes. So they actually need a behavioral component too. This gets back to the idea, you should always do behavioral testing when you do brain testing to learn things. If you've done neurofeedback with me or been trained by me, you know that we always test executive function alongside the brain, the QEEG. And the reason is because when putting those two things in contrast, you can really learn quite a lot about the phenomena. A lot more than looking at one snapshot of performance or a brain at rest when you put them together. So third, this metadata study found that this quality, this methodological quality, predicted the outcome in the study. So studies scoring higher on the CRED-NF checklist showed larger effect sizes. So again, high quality studies, 1.07 in the Hedges G, which is a large effect. And lower quality studies were still 0.49, which is small to moderate. But in athletic performance, even the small ones, good, a few percentage points is the difference between first place and fifth place in competitions. But an effect of one is a huge impact. So previous metadata studies on sport exist. There's one in 2018 with 10 studies, another in 2021 with 13 studies, and this one had 21 studies. And again, over half of the high quality recent studies in this work, the ones that showed this bigger impact, those were all published after the previous metadata reviews. Those studies were all published in 2022 through 2024. So this is definitely giving us a better perspective on how sport impacts or is impacted by neurofeedback, much stronger evidence. And we also are seeing now across these studies some hints about how you do neurofeedback and what matters in terms of session, maybe intensity and pacing and things like that. All right. The E-Sunlight. Hey, the E-Sunlight. How are you tonight? Or if it's morning for you, good morning tomorrow. So let's talk a little bit about what counts on these studies as performance and who improves. Let's get specific because sports performance can mean a bunch of stuff in the literature. These performance studies measured, across the 21 studies, measured a bunch of things. And the majority of them had precision sports, i.e. golf, putting accuracy and consistency, archery scoring at competitive distance, rifle and pistol shooting, precision, grouping and dispersion, and dart throwing accuracy. So fine motor, precision, basically. There's also other motor tasks in many of these sports, dance performance, dynamic balance, cycling, time to exhaustion, which is interesting. Ice hockey shooting accuracy was what they measured there. And in basketball, it was free throws. So, all these sports, all these things measured are kind of closed skill precision tasks, self-paced activity where you need fine grain control over your hands, your fine motor control, and the ability to kind of not be in your own way mentally. So that's the grouping in a sport performance that we're looking at here. Now, who improves? Again, across all studies, the meta-analysis cut to near significance. It was a trend, p-value of 0.06, so almost significant. So 6% chance of it happening by pure luck. So they did fine. Let's see. If you split it apart, novices seem to have an effect from neurofeedback a lot more than experts in the sport. So if you look at experts, the Hedges effect size drops to 0.6, which that G value is significant, moderate effect, but the Hedges in the novices was 1.23, a large effect. So it makes some sense. If you're undertrained or underskilled, there's more room to close the gap more rapidly. So if you're already intermediate to advanced, there's less room to ceiling, so to speak, to quick change anyways. But here's the nuance. Even for experts, a 0.6 effect size is meaningful. In elite sports, the difference between, again, first place and fifth place, 1%, 2%. So even modest improvements like this matter when you're already really strong. And the weaker effects here are that level. So the takeaway, set realistic expectations based on where you are. If you're already an elite performer, push the value up. If you're injured, rehab is part of the equation. If you're weaker with a huge handicap, you might see some substantial improvements. So, all right, let me give you a real world example. I worked with a hockey player for a while, a guy named Connor Carrick, who's worked for a couple of big league teams. Just moved to Europe, but he was working with the Oilers most recently before that. And Connor came to see me before the Oilers. He was working in his previous team, and he got injured and was out of play. And for a hockey player, that's a big deal. Young guy, strong guy. And he came to see me. We did a brain map. And let me show you is this the right? Actually, I'm not sure where the picture is. Let's see. I think it's behind. Yeah, there it is. Let me move myself over. There it is, and move this over too. Whoops. Sorry, it takes me a minute sometimes to find the right. There we go. All right. And might as well move myself back in a frame too, because you guys might miss me. All right, so what we're seeing here are QEEG images. If you haven't seen QEEG images, they are measuring how strong someone's basic brain patterns are against the average person their age at rest. These sort of stable resource traits. They're not picking up how someone's feeling, but basically how their brain is hanging out in different big areas, different amounts of brain waves. And you can see here in this upper panel on the left, all that red under theta brain waves. If you look carefully, there's a scale there under the alpha showing that there's a plus or minus 3. It's a bell curve, population average, or z-score. So Connor was dealing with huge amounts of theta brain waves and some delta and some alpha in the back of the head that were very high. And he was also dealing with low power beta relatively, like a lot of difficulty using the visual system in the back of the head. As you can see, all that blue means that the slow brainwaves were taken over. He had probably a concussion, and all of this residual wear and tear from it months later were showing that there was a fogginess, a visual tracking, a fatigue, some classic concussion type symptoms still, like sensitivity and fatigue. And not ideal. And you can see there, we did about 50 sessions in neurofeedback, and you can see that he did make quite a huge change in his resting brain. So there in the second panel there at the bottom, same guy, but about 3 months later, and he worked out all those resources. He worked down all that theta, that delta, that alpha. He brought up that beta. If you look carefully, you can see hints of the old patterns there, but huge changes in his resting brain. And this is about the time he got signed to the Oilers and went back to work. So that was pretty good, and he was successful enough at that they poached him and brought him to Europe, I think. So let me see. Let me show you another image. It's related. So this one, once I pull it out from behind me, is showing executive function testing. So this left side of the test is before. This is again Connor, and you can see if you look carefully, if you haven't seen these scores, you're looking at executive function or attention. The purple, blue, and red bars, the left side is how activated you can be and grab information, and the right side is how careful or monitoring you can be versus impulsive. And Connor's scores were already actually really, really strong. He doesn't have any problem at all. He was 128 for his attention and up in the 90s for his impulsivity. And the impulsivity was only there because this darker blue bar called stamina was down. So basically he was only really tiring out a little bit and getting a bit reactive or brittle. Now, not ideal for an athlete, but this guy's already significantly above most people at baseline, except for some tiring out of resources at a high level. Well, that's interesting. And you saw how much there was in that visual system, how much blue there was, how much red in the back of the head. And that's the dark blue bars here being extra low in the visual domain. If you look carefully at speed, the red bar is also lower in the visual domain compared to the auditory. So pretty significant pinches in visual, but high performer, that just brought him down to way better than most people instead of an exceptionally, massively high performer. And then you can see on the right, that's him after doing 50 sessions of neurofeedback. And you can see it's not that dramatic, but you can see that the good stuff got better. The left side of that test went up by a few points. And the right side, the stamina difficulties eased. And the dark green bars, his consistency in the resource, that came way up. So this is an example of what happens with a high performer. You might identify a performance bottleneck. In this case, he knew why. Often with a high performer, it's a performance thing where they're like kind of worried, if you will, about their performance or having the yips in some way. And so it ends up being something where, let me get this back on the middle of the screen here. It ends up being something where you work with people at the edge of their performance limits and you ease those and they perform a whole lot better. But for him, you could see the deficit jumping right out. Even though it wasn't huge in performance, you can still see the improvements in performance over a few months of time. And for someone like this makes a big difference. So let me answer some more questions here. Demovicious. Hi, Andrew, I'm a fan. Hey, Demovicious. Good screen name. Ilya, so basically means that the result of neurofeedbacks are more tangible in a peak sports performance application than perhaps an average individual or someone with more pathology support needs. No, I think, but within a sport performance context, Ilya, the novice in the sport will make more change in the sport given neurofeedback than the expert in the sport, basically. I will say that in clinical complaints, let's say, we see the same thing in some ways if we reframe it a little bit. And I would argue, you might agree with this, you might have seen this. In some ways, the worse things are in neurofeedback, the more deficits, the more challenges there are in executive function, stress and anxiety, sleep, the faster things actually change. The quicker you get that first big shift of change. I think that's what's happening here. There's more room to improve sport performance in people that are less well experienced, and so they're getting a bigger boost. And Connor, as you saw, was already at the top of his game, no pun intended, and we were able to identify the slight performance bottlenecks and ease, but he also felt quite a bit different throughout the process of rebuilding his brain. So different perspectives depending on the individual and what you're working on. Jan has a question. Can athletic performance be applied to enhancing athletic performance, be applied to slowing down the causes of aging? Yes, it can. You would use very similar things around watching reaction time, watching sustained attention, watching sleep regulation to make sure that aging is also moving in the proper direction. Absolutely, yeah. And that's sort of what matters here. Connor had this perspective about recovering from concussion, but it's not about necessarily recovering from concussion. It's about returning to elite level performance for this person. And for you, if you're aging, it might become about flattening the trajectory of decline or improving it against your particular improvement. So, you end up with measurable things, not just subjectively, I feel better. And like your alpha speed, let's say with aging, if your alpha speed recovers over time, gets crisper and crisper and crisper, then that is your brain getting faster and essentially younger in its processing speed. That has a huge impact on things like mood and awareness and intelligence. So anyways, this NHL athlete example is particularly compelling because these guys are already at the peak of the human performance in some ways, and there's still room for building when you can. All right, so now looking at this previous research and a couple other studies that I referenced looking at motor learning, and the motor learning practice that's being measured actually isn't that much to pick up change. So it looks like when you're doing neurofeedback and doing the motor practice of the sport, you get much bigger effects. And the amount of total training time is only a few hours, it looks like, to create this effect. Across these studies, you're only getting a couple hours, 2-3 hours of total training time. Now, it's being broken up into 15 or 20 minute or 30 minute chunks, but it means you're getting effects in 4, 5, 6 studies. And this meta-analysis, while it showed some weak effects, it also showed several studies with single sessions getting a sport performance. And this must be like an arousal level, control over activation level, or calmness, or something like that. But for most practical applications, this literature would suggest that you can probably get a noticeable effect on sport in as little as 2 or 3 weeks. And that's about when we traditionally think of neurofeedback as emerging, the effects emerging in things like sleep and executive function. But that little effect, 2 weeks in, it may be enough to change your performance on the sport pitch. So, all right, so this is, I'm not gonna get into protocols as much. This will be an SMR approach tailored to the individual. You might train upper alpha for speed of processing. If you're overthinking or you have this paralysis by analysis, Hamlet's disease, maybe you inhibit theta on the front midline. But generally, you want to do a brain map and then tailor your approaches to your needs the same way you might do a lipid panel or a bone density scan or something, and target your work towards that. So come get a brain map with us at Peak Brain. They're $250 off. $250 once a year after the discount gets you unlimited brain maps within reason at New York City office, St. Louis, Los Angeles, Orange County, Palm Beach, and you can do a remote one with us as well, though it's not unlimited and it's slightly more expensive. But definitely come check us out. There's links in the show notes here at the bottom for the video for booking a call with me or grabbing that deal. So when you're measuring your sport and performance, when you're layering in some biofeedback or neurofeedback, when it comes to the sport and figuring out what's working, one thing that comes out of these studies is measuring the actual mechanism of the sport seems to be where the changes are made. So if it's like shot grouping or dispersion, measure that centimeters or that inches. If it's putting accuracy, measure the percentage or the strokes. If it's consistency, measure how you're performing each run, each at bat, etc. And figure out pre-post baselines. You should see performance differences based on sleep hacking, meditation, etc. Not just neurofeedback, but neurofeedback do generally make these impacts. So let's see, a couple questions. Ilya, true, the worse the conditions at the beginning, the more palpable the results they report. Yeah, very strong results. That happens here too. The more need you have for a rehab, so to speak, in a sport and performance context, or, I've worked with folks that are still novices in sports and can't quite get it. And I've worked with people that are like musicians that can't quite get rhythm. And I kind of consider it the same. You can do the training and create such plasticity that the sport or the music learning or the gelling with the band or the team suddenly works a lot better. So I've seen a huge amount of this stuff in person. I've trained for brain training done race car drivers, a lot of soccer players, especially women because their injury rates are so high. A lot of hockey players, a few anyways, 5 or 6. Some NFL players. What else? Some British football players, men and women. Several other people, boxers, kickboxers. Oddly enough, the contact sports, boxers, kickboxers, etc., generally have the least brain injuries, the fewest brain injuries. It's very strange. But anyways, I wanted to show you guys something a little bit because Ryan was asking some great questions at the beginning, and I'm making you wait to the end because I wanted to show you a little bit of the mechanism of how neurofeedback works. And I want to introduce you to a concept of something called the ERSP. Now, the ERSP stands for Event-Related Spectral Perturbation. And you can see here above my head, there's a panel. In the left, we have frequency, and we're looking at 0 through about 36 hertz on the left. On the bottom, we're looking at milliseconds, and you can see there's a 0 line as a vertical. And what we're looking at are the brain events, the brain frequency shifting in response to the neurofeedback beep. So if you are doing C3 beta rewards, right after the brain makes a burst of C3 beta, you will end up getting a beep back from the computer, basically. Or after you stay above a threshold for a certain amount of time, you get some reward events happening. And the reward events, in this case, are yoked or averaged at the 0 point. And what I've done is create about a 2-second window. I've zoomed in a bit more for the frequency analysis. But about a 2-second window where 0 plus or minus 1 second is the event. And what you're seeing are different frequencies reacting to the beep and the simultaneous unveiling of the game stimulus on the screen. And if you look, there's a couple of big things showing up. There's this red blob, which is in the slow frequencies, maybe in the theta range. And that is happening about 200 milliseconds in, 180 to 200. And that's pretty much an auditory evoked potential, like a P200 or P2. And then you can see this little blue stripe here at the top. And that starts off, after the 0 point. And then if you look carefully, the frequency it's operating at seems to be somewhere between 12 and 20. It's maybe up around 16 or 17 hertz. So this was the result of my, this is the product of my research, my PhD research a little bit. And so I was doing neurofeedback on someone's brain at C3 with a 64-channel cap on top of their head. And so let me show you a little more of that event-related spectral perturbation. So let me show it to you at the C3 electrode. Come out from behind. Maybe. There I am. All right. So this event-related spectral perturbation, ERSP. And it's a little bit of a busy slide, so let me spend a moment talking to you. I was just showing you the slide in the upper left, or pretty much showing you the slide in the upper left. But if you look, there's columns labeled C3 beta, C3 SMR, C4 SMR, and sham. And those are the neurofeedback protocols these groups of people were doing. And then the top row is the first 10 minutes of their very first neurofeedback session. That's the top block. And if you look carefully, the top left block, C3 beta, has that faster beta, blue stripe. But the C3 SMR, we don't see it quite so clearly. And then when you look down to the second row, that's the last 10 minutes of the very first session. Well, now you see a very thick blue stripe in the SMR frequency range for C3 SMR, and a little bit of a faster frequency still showing up in the C3 beta. As you look down the C3 beta column, those top 4 are the first 10 minutes, next 10 minutes of the very first session, and the first 10 minutes and the last 10 minutes of the 5th session. So by the boxes at the bottom, you can see a very clear blue stripe up in the 15 to 18 hertz range when it's C3 beta. You can see a lower frequency blue stripe in the C3 SMR. In the 4th column, which is C4 training, C4 SMR training, again, there's a 12 hertz line. And then the sham condition doesn't have those blue lines because you're not getting entrainment. You aren't getting the brain reacting to the neurofeedback. And again, this is under the C3 electrode. These 4 different protocols are people that are experiencing neurofeedback in real time, but you're measuring under just one side, C3. And before I switch pages, I want you to observe that the stronger blue lines on the left-hand side here. So you're getting more of an effect under the training wire, right? And that's happening in the first session. It happens in C3 beta, the very first 10 minutes, clearly, and in C3 SMR, at least by the end of the first half an hour. The brain is reacting, and those reactions get a little stronger and more clear, so to speak, later in the session. Now that's the C3 electrode. What about the C4 electrode? That's this one. Now check that out. Look at the C4 column. That's the column there on the right. Thick, thick, thick blue line under C4 and none under sham. Under the C3, we get a little bit on the SMR frequency. We don't see nearly as much on the left side of the page here. And it also looks like we're getting a thin blue line at 12 hertz in the first 10 minutes at C4 SMR and the next 10 minutes at C4 SMR. So one thing this appears to show us is that SMR under C4 trains a bit faster and C3 beta trains a bit faster than the alternate frequencies, which makes some sense because left side runs a bit faster. But what we're seeing is there is some specificity of the training effect in hemisphere. But if you look very, very carefully, you're also seeing some effect. C3 SMR training has an effect as well at the C4 electrode. This is the C4 electrode, the right-hand side. And you're training the left-hand side. You're getting a 12 hertz echo. And I did some more decomposition of that and found that the signals that are being rewarded on the left side have an echo in the homotopic frequencies in sight in the opposite side. So you are getting crosstalk a little bit, but this shows us that, hey, again, you're getting effects in the very first 10 minutes of the very first session, and you don't really get them in sham. Those effects build up and they're more clear, more noticeable over time, and you don't really get them in sham. So that's a pretty big evidence for someone like Ryan about how many sessions do you need to get an effect. Not very many. And the literature showed single session effects that I mentioned. And you can get actual sport and performance effects, it looks like, in 3 hours, maybe 6, 7 sessions, 10 sessions. I would say generally when I do neurofeedback, you can measure the brain with a QEEG at sessions 12, 13, 14, 15, and you might not see much change in the resting patterns. But as you move from 15 up to 18 or 20 sessions, you're much more likely to see resting change. So this is one reason why I do brain maps for clinical reasons, for neurofeedback guidance at the beginning, and then about every 25 sessions in is plenty, because you're just seeing the changes really bloom that you're looking for by that point. And if you map earlier at 12 or 15 sessions, for some people you might be getting subjective effects, but nothing building up in the resting brain yet. So that really unpacks a little bit about how the time course of the training works, and I thought you guys would appreciate that piece of it a little bit more. The ERSP. So I'll leave that one on the screen. Looks kind of pretty. I did want to mention that the studies that were reviewed in this metadata analysis, there is a lot of heterogeneity in the studies. I mean, there's variability in the results even within studies across participants. So that means that not everyone's responding the same way, and some individuals may be seeing huge gains, others modest, and others maybe none, and that would not get picked up in a study like this. Also, many of these studies had relatively small sample sizes, small n. Total of 271 participants across 21 studies, 13 average per study, not thousands. So yes, the effect sizes are really strong, but they can be less stable with smaller samples. And you'd either want to do, replication a few times or a much larger study to make sure the effect size is still there. Also, only about half the study is really scored as good on the CRED-NF checklist. So some common gaps were the studies didn't report whether participants were given any cognitive strategies, maybe not documenting data processing and artifact correction mechanisms. 3/4 or more of the studies did those first two things. And then half the studies didn't correlate behavioral regulation success in the brain with behavioral outcome in the sport. And you don't always see that in a few sessions, which is maybe why. I have found that in 6 sessions, while you can get these effects, you don't actually necessarily get a shift within the session of the resting EEG. And that can happen even with large changes in the things you're training. Sorry, without large changes in the things you're training. Let's see. A couple questions here. El Chatterino, is that flow state tuning? Yes, if you're doing alpha speed training as well as alpha theta manipulation with athletes, you would actually give them some access to flow, sure. Jehan, blue makes me think the beta is going down even though you are training beta up. Good question, good observation. So we are looking at something called an ERSP. This is comprised of 2 different types of ERPs visualizing spectral changes. There's something called an event-related synchronization, an ERS, and an event-related desynchronization, an ERD. And what's happening here is that we're causing brief amplitude surges of beta from the beep of the reward, but those surges are not in phase. And so they're desynchronizing. But the beep is causing a strong auditory P2, and so you're getting a synchronous auditory event in the slow frequencies as the brain binds to information of the beep. And then you're getting the entrainment information, not entrainment, sorry, the feedback, the learning information, the yoke of the signal in a burst of amplitude that's not phase locked. And so it ends up dropping out in power because this is, each one of these ERSP plots is comprised of, the minimum 700 samples. And some of these are 2,000 samples to create in some of the conditions. Let's see. Great data, says Jehan. Thank you. Ilya is asking, can Eager run ERP data? I don't think Eager has an ERP module at this point. I don't know that ERPs are as useful for training. I think they're useful for assessments, perhaps, or for understanding how the brain works. But it's kind of like Eslaretta, Ilya. Like, yeah, you can do it with tools, but it doesn't work any better than regular neurofeedback, and it can work less well. And so training the ERP, while some people are starting to do it, it's not well understood. And it doesn't seem to serve it doesn't solve any needs as far as I know. So, just like Eager can do these days, Eager just added a module for doing sub-hertz or below 1 hertz training. You would need the proper amplifier and electrodes. They'll probably at some point add ERP training, but I'm not a huge fan of it. I think we elaborate without getting good tools that we need to use, better games, better tracking, better data, easier, robust software, things that aren't breaky and don't require lots of Windows updates to make work. So we're still in a niche location for software. So unfortunately, not every software package does everything. So also a couple more caveats on that study I mentioned. When they compared sham to non-sham, the studies that had placebo actually had weaker effects, which was interesting. So it might mean that we have poor control over the placebo, or there's a sort of non-blinding effect where the attention and practice had an impact. So it could make the effect sizes more strong than they should be. All right, so this is the general idea, is that you can make changes in your performance. And I have inevitably get asked by somebody in a podcast or in comments on a YouTube channel, hint, hint, about this idea that is this ethical to change your brain and create faster reaction times, less impulsivity, deeper sleep, better recovery, more sustained attention, etc. Is this neurodoping? And I included a copy of the WADA guides for this year just to prove, in the notes below, just to prove to you that, you can do biofeedback and neurofeedback on your brain. The neuro augmentation you will do here that will improve your sport performance is legal in sport competition. So if you are finding yourself from chess to fencing to to cycling, you're finding yourself performing not as well as you want to. Well, you've been training your legs, your patience, your understanding of patterns for a long time. Maybe time to train your brain directly. And I can help you understand a little bit about how your brain works, so come see me for some brain maps if you want. Hey, the sunlight, except for having another EEG, is there any other way to figure out how neurofeedback has been effective? Yeah, you can do attention testing, CPT, go, no-go style tests, pick up changes in neurofeedback quite a bit. If you're in school, academic testing will almost always show a change, especially for younger kids. You can see sleep changes on sleep trackers with your neurofeedback changing. You can see HRV levels on HRV assessment devices and HRV biofeedback devices. You can see medication changes, like as neurofeedback starts to work well, certain medications get way too strong, like stimulants. So yeah, tons of ways where you can tell that the neurofeedback is having a big impact without just looking at the QEEG. In fact, the QEEG should really be showing you things you already think because of what the person's experiencing and that you've measured out in other ways, like attention testing that's hard to misinterpret, so to speak, and hard to just, believe. So yes, lots of ways should converge when you're doing your job well. You'll see all kinds of data converging for each individual in the same direction, not just the EEG. Ilya saying, and ERP assessments don't necessarily provide more useful data than the CPT. No, I don't think they do, actually. I think you really want to have a CPT combined with an ERP to get the most out of the CPT. You'd want to gather events during it. And then you'd be able to tease out another level that we're not necessarily capturing just in the QEEG and in the CPT itself. But we don't need to do that, I would say, to understand most of what we would see and understand from the QEEG, like slowing, like low power, like impulsivity. We'll see that other ways too. So I'm not sure that the ERP really helps much here in a training or assessment mechanism for neurofeedback. Damo Vicious, does it improve tennis? Yes, neurofeedback can have huge impacts on tennis. I have several clients. I have several adolescents who compete professionally as tennis players who've done amazing things professionally, a few adults. Yeah, and this will help you not overreact. It'll help your hand-eye coordination, balance, reaction time, all kinds of things. And tennis is one of the places you'll notice a really big impact. The other place, I often have other athletes who don't play baseball go to batting cages because you'll notice the effect when hitting a baseball. Hitting a baseball is about the most taxed the combination of motor skills and brain ever gets to be at one moment. And so if you can go to the batting cage and hit reliably, you can do any sport pretty much under high stress, at least sports that require rapid execution. Jehan, why would brain training be less ethical than physical training? Just saying. Yeah, exactly, right? This is just a form of training. And if you want to do it, then do it. Exactly. The sunlight 2268, can neurofeedback be of any help when it comes to oversensitivity to clothing texture? How about oversensitivity to smell? Yeah, to both those things. You probably have a big, giant right tempoparietal junction cramping up. But yes, sensory sensitivities are things that we generally see really good impacts on with neurofeedback. So do a QEEG, look at your brain, see what happens. But I would expect so, sure. That should be a very addressable target for you, yeah. Well, thanks for listening to me tonight, guys. I really appreciate all your time. Seems like we had some decent audio and visual and did not get too interrupted by the internet gods. So that's wonderful. I will see you guys next week about the same time. Do let me know if there's topics you want to talk about and want me to talk about, things you want to tell me, things you want to ask. If you want to talk in person, just grab a quick call. I have time every week. I give away free half-hour calls if there's things you want to ask. And if you want to do neurofeedback, again, you can come to an office or you can do it fully remotely. In the US as well as the UK and Europe, we do fully remote neurofeedback. So you can work with us no matter where you are. So hope you guys are having a great evening. If it's evening for you, morning if you're watching tomorrow, or it's someplace on the other side of the planet. Thanks for watching. Thanks for paying attention. Thanks for all your awesome questions. Do me a favor, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed yet, and leave a comment in this video or another one, or maybe share it out to another platform. YouTube gods love when you do that, and it means more to me than you might expect. So I hope you're having a great evening. Take care of those brains, and I'll talk